Hi, it's Amin. I'm gonna talk about how to make serverless services using AWS Lambda. This is not limited to AWS Lambda. It could apply to any serverless framework or any serverless uh, functions. Google Cloud probably supports it. Azure probably supports it, but I've only used it on AWS, and I'm sure it works there. Um, so yeah, let's dig in. How does it work conceptually? Imagine you have a source of data, um, maybe a request, and then you want to do some processing, and you want to send a response back. In this case, we are working with AWS Lambda, which has some characteristics. For example, you can have almost limitless concurrency, but there are some limitations on the CPU usage, on the processing time and memory, and so on. And conceptually, it's pretty simple, but yeah, let's see how it works. So where is the request coming from? It could be coming from multiple sources. It could be coming from AWS Step Functions, uh, SQS, API Gateway. There are many ways you can call a Lambda function. Each of these could be considered one way to invoke these functions. But in this case, we are mostly interested in SQS and API Gateway because uh, we are interested in a service that uh, does request handling. So what is really a service? Service could mean many things, but quite simply, it's an application that waits for requests, does some processing, and sends a response back. Well, in this case, we are talking about um, API gateway, SQS, Lambda functions. So we are talking about AWS components. On the left side, you'll see the event source or API gateway request. And mm, either event bridge rules need to wait on SQS messages, or API gateway waits for a request from the client side. So AWS in this case is the one that actually waits for the request to come. And your Lambda function so far doesn't do anything. Your Lambda function is offline. It's not even running. And yeah, until there's a request or an event, it's not even there. It's defined, but it's not running. The moment we receive an event or request, AWS passes it to the Lambda function. It could be one Lambda function, or depending on the concurrent requests, the concurrency settings, it could be many Lambda functions running at the same time. So this is something that happens inside of AWS. You don't have much control over it. But at the same time, um, you do have some control. For example, you can have the concurrency settings for the SQS, but basically whatever AWS provides for you. In this case, your Lambda function could act as a web service, responding to RESTful API calls, or it could act as an async task processing tool that reads the gets the request as an event, processes them, and pushes them back somewhere or publishes them. And on the publishing or sending the response back, again, we are handing this off to AWS itself most of the times. So for example, in case of API gateway, it supports reading the response from the AWS Lambda. This is the generic way of how it works. You can use ready-made framework like Serverless to make it work, or you can write the infrastructure code to make it happen. So yeah, basically this is how it would look like. Couple of advantages and disadvantages. Let's start with the advantages. First of all, it's cheap. You don't pay for the idle time. So as long as you don't get any requests, you don't pay anything. It's simple. There's no service maintenance. You don't have to see if the service is running or not, because it's all handled on the AWS side, and there's high availability on the services, and it works out of the box. So there's a lot of magic happening on the background you don't see, but AWS is in charge, so you can trust it. There are some disadvantages as well. The first and most important one is the Lambda limitation. Yeah, so Lambdas are not allowed to execute more than a certain time, or have more than a certain amount of memory or CPU. So if you're using this service for some heavy task, this is not a suitable solution for you. And the second disadvantage is that it's not easy to debug, and it comes from the fact that it's kind of like a magic that AWS handles a lot of it under the hood for you. You don't know how it works, so it's not actually easy to debug if something doesn't work as it should. But most of the time it does. All right, that's all. Till next time.